What does it mean to owe a life? In 1876, a black cowboy found a child wandering alone in Apache territory, a discovery that would force him to confront the most painful secret of his past. Some debts can never be repaid, or can they? What if the person who once saved you now stands ready to take everything you love? Stay with me until the end to discover how one man's journey of honor became the most controversial tale of the American frontier, one that the history books tried to erase. Before we ride into this incredible true story, I need you to do something important. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now. Why? Because The Black Rancher is dedicated to uncovering the forgotten heroes of the West, the black cowboys, ranchers, and pioneers whose courage and sacrifice helped build America. These stories deserve to be told, and I'm making it my mission to bring them to light. If you've ever wondered about the untold history of the frontier, this channel is for you. Subscribe now, share this video with someone who appreciates powerful stories, and let's ride together into Chapter 1 of a tale that will change how you see American history forever. Welcome to The Black Rancher. My name is Thomas Freeman, and today's story will test everything you thought you knew about loyalty, family, and redemption on the frontier. Texas-New Mexico border, 1876. Thomas "Tom" Washington pulled his coat tighter as the autumn wind cut across the high desert plateau. At 43, his broad shoulders still carried the strength that had made him invaluable on the cattle drives north, but 15 years of freedom had added silver streaks to his closely cropped beard and lines of wisdom around his eyes. The Lone Star Ranch wasn't much by white men's standards, just 300 acres of rocky terrain with a creek running through it, but it was his. 6 years of saving every penny while working as a trail boss for the Mitchell outfit had finally paid off. The previous winter, Tom had signed the deed with a steady hand, while the county clerk watched in poorly disguised disbelief. "A good day's ride tomorrow and we'll be back home," Tom said to his chestnut-gelding Scout as he secured the last stake of his small camp. He had come to the border to purchase 2 young bulls from a rancher in Santa Fe, beasts with bloodlines that would strengthen his small but growing herd. The transaction had gone better than expected, the seller impressed enough by Tom's knowledge of cattle breeding to throw in a pregnant heifer at no extra cost. As darkness settled across the land, Tom fed small branches into his campfire, watching the flames dance against the vast canvas of stars above. This remote stretch between settlements was dangerous territory, Apache land by rights. Though the white man's government had other ideas, most travelers avoided it entirely. Tom wasn't most travelers. During his years as a trail boss, he'd developed an understanding with several Apache scouts. He spoke enough of their language to communicate basic respect, and he never crossed their hunting grounds during sacred times. They left him alone, and occasionally they even traded, jerked venison for coffee and sugar. He was just settling in with his tin cup of coffee when Scout's ears pricked forward, the horse's sudden alertness cutting through the night's quiet. "What is it, boy?" Tom whispered, reaching slowly for the rifle that never left his side. The sound came again, not the approach of riders or the growl of a predator, but something altogether unexpected. A child's whimper. Tom stood, scanning the darkness beyond his campfire. "Who's there?" he called, first in English, then in his limited Apache. The whimpering stopped, replaced by the rustle of sagebrush about 30 yards from camp. Tom grabbed a burning branch from the fire to use as a torch and moved cautiously toward the sound. What he found froze him in place. A small boy, no more than 5 years old, huddled against a boulder. His black hair hung in matted strands around a dirt-streaked face. Torn deerskin clothing hung from his thin frame, and dried blood crusted a cut on his forehead. His dark eyes reflected the torchlight with a mixture of fear and defiance. The child was Apache. Tom crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you lost, little one?" he asked gently in Apache. The boy's only response was to press himself more firmly against the rock. "I won't hurt you," Tom continued, setting his torch in the ground and slowly removing a strip of dried beef from his pocket. He placed it on the ground between them. For long minutes, neither moved. Then hunger won over caution. The boy darted forward, snatched the jerky, and retreated to his boulder, tearing into the food with desperate intensity. "Where is your family?" Tom asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The boy's eyes welled with tears as he pointed vaguely eastward and made a gesture Tom recognized, the sign for death. "Your people were attacked." The child nodded, holding up 5 fingers, then pointing to the moon and back to his fingers. 5 moons ago," Tom translated aloud. 5 months. The boy nodded again. "How have you survived?" Tom asked, genuine amazement in his voice. Rather than answering, the child simply stared at him with eyes that had seen too much for their few years. Tom made a decision then that would alter the course of both their lives. "Would you like to come with me? I have a ranch, food, safety." For the first time, uncertainty replaced fear in the boy's expression. He glanced over his shoulder, back toward the eastern horizon, then at Tom again. "My name is Tom," he said, placing a hand on his chest. After a long moment, the boy mirrored the gesture. "Na Kitso," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Na Kitso," Tom repeated carefully. "It is good to meet you. Are you hungry for more than jerky?" The smallest of nods answered him. "Then come. My fire is warm and my coffee pot is full." Tom stood slowly and walked back toward his camp without looking back. After several moments, he heard the soft footfalls of the boy following him. By firelight, the child's condition was even worse than Tom had initially thought. Beneath the dirt and dried blood, his small body bore the marks of starvation and exposure. As he devoured the beans and bacon Tom warmed for him, Nakitso's eyes never left the darkness beyond their circle of light, as if expecting danger to emerge at any moment. When the boy finally fell asleep, wrapped in Tom's spare blanket by the fire, Tom stayed awake, his rifle across his knees. His mind raced with questions. What had happened to the child's family? How had such a young boy survived alone for months in this unforgiving land? And most pressingly, what should he do now? The responsible action would be to take the boy to the nearest settlement and seek out someone from his tribe. But Tom knew what that likely meant. The child would either be sent to a government school where they'd beat his language and culture out of him, or worse, he'd be caught in the crossfire of the ongoing conflicts between the Apache and the U.S. Army. As dawn broke across the eastern horizon, Tom had made his decision. He would take Nakitso home to the Lone Star Ranch. He would protect him, feed him, give him shelter. What happened after that? Well, that bridge would need crossing when they came to it. What Tom didn't know, couldn't know, was that his act of compassion had set in motion a chain of events that would eventually bring him face to face with a debt 15 years overdue, and a woman who had every right to claim his life as her own. This is The Black Rancher, bringing you the untold stories of America's frontier. If you're just joining us, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the powerful conclusion to this true tale of honor and redemption. Now let's continue with Chapter 2, where Tom Washington's decision to help one child will soon test everything he believes about family, duty, and the true meaning of freedom. 3 months passed at the Lone Star Ranch, and with each sunrise, Nakitso grew stronger. The hollow cheeks filled out, the wary eyes began to hold moments of childish curiosity, and occasionally, rarely but precious, Tom was rewarded with the sound of laughter. Tom had built a small room onto his cabin for the boy, furnished with a proper bed and a chest for the clothes they had purchased on their one trip into town. That venture had been fraught with tense moments, suspicious glances from white townsfolk, confused and sometimes hostile whispers. "Since when do Buffalo soldiers adopt Injun children?" Tom had overheard the general store owner mutter to his wife. "I ain't no soldier," Tom had responded calmly, though his hand had tightened around Nakitso's. "Just a rancher buying supplies for his family." The word family had slipped out naturally, surprising even Tom himself. But in the weeks since finding the boy, that's precisely what they had become. Communication remained challenging. Tom's Apache was limited, and Nakitso's English consisted of only a few words, but they developed their own language of gestures, expressions, and shared experiences. Tom taught the boy about cattle and horses, showing him how to brush down, scout, and feed the chickens that provided their eggs. In return, Nakitso revealed his own gifts. The child possessed an uncanny ability to track animals, spotting signs invisible to Tom's eyes. He knew which plants were edible, which held medicinal properties. One evening when Tom's old shoulder wound flared up with the changing weather, the boy disappeared briefly into the scrubland and returned with herbs that, when boiled and applied as a poultice, eased the pain better than any doctor's remedy. December arrived with an unusual cold snap. Tom and Nakitso sat by the fireplace, the boy watching intently as Tom whittled a small wooden horse. "For you," Tom said, handing the finished carving to the child. Nakitso examined the gift with solemn appreciation before placing it carefully on the small shelf above his bed where he kept his treasures. A hawk feather, a smooth river stone, an arrowhead found near the creek. "Tomorrow," Tom said, pointing out the window at the gathering clouds. "Snow." The boy nodded, then hesitated, an internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he pointed to himself, then to the east, then made a sweeping gesture with his arms that Tom had come to understand meant, "My people." "You're thinking about your family," Tom said softly. Nakitso nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, a sorrow no child should have to carry. "Would you like to tell me what happened?" Tom asked, keeping his voice gentle. He'd never pushed the boy to share the trauma that had left him alone in the wilderness, but perhaps now he was ready. For a long moment, Tom thought Nakitso wouldn't answer. Then the child began to speak, his voice quiet but steady, using a mixture of Apache words, English, and gestures to convey his story. His band had been camped near a river valley when the soldiers came at dawn. Not a proper battle. There were no warriors present, just women, children, and elders. His mother had hidden him beneath a buffalo robe as the shooting started, whispering for him to run to the hills and not look back. He had obeyed, crawling through the grass until he reached the tree line, the sounds of screams and gunfire fading behind him. For days afterward, he had hidden in a cave, afraid to return to the campsite. When hunger finally drove him back, he found only ashes and bones. He had wandered then, surviving on roots and berries, occasionally stealing from white settlers' gardens under cover of darkness, until Tom had found him. When the boy finished his account, tears streaked silently down his face. Without a word, Tom moved to sit beside him and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Your mother was very brave," he said. "She saved your life." Nakitso looked up at him, the question in his eyes clear even without words. "What now?" "You can stay here as long as you wish," Tom said firmly. "This is your home now, if you want it to be." For the first time, the boy leaned into Tom's side, accepting the tentative embrace. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, blanketing the Lone Star Ranch in hushed white. Inside, by firelight, a new family bond strengthened, fragile still, but growing more solid with each passing day. But neither Tom nor Nakitso could know that, less than 50 miles away, a lone Apache woman tracked across the winter landscape, following rumors of a black rancher and a child who matched the description of her sister's son, the nephew she had spent 5 months searching for with relentless determination. The woman paused at the crest of a ridge, pulling her woolen blanket tighter against the cold. Her name was Nasha, and 15 years earlier she had saved a young black man from certain death at the hands of Confederate deserters. Now fate had brought them together again, connected by the child who represented her last living family. As she looked toward the distant horizon where the Lone Star Ranch lay, Nasha's expression hardened with resolve. She would reclaim what was hers, even if it meant confronting the man whose life she had once spared. Spring came early to the Lone Star Ranch. The creek swelled with snowmelt, wildflowers carpeted the lower pastures, and Nakitso transformed from a silent shadow into a boy whose laughter rang across the property as he chased the new calves or rode proudly atop Scout, Tom's steady hand on his back. The changes in the child weren't just physical. His English improved daily, though he still spoke with an accent that combined Apache rhythms with Tom's deep southern cadence. More importantly, the haunted look had begun to fade from his eyes, replaced by the natural curiosity and resilience of childhood. Tom had started teaching him to read using an old Bible and a copy of the Farmer's Almanac. Nakitso absorbed the lessons eagerly, tracing letters in the dust with a stick when paper was scarce. "You're a smart boy," Tom told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Could be a doctor or lawyer someday if that's what you want." Nakitso shook his head firmly. "Want to be rancher like you." The simple declaration filled Tom's chest with a warmth he hadn't experienced since before the war, before he'd escaped from the plantation in Mississippi that had held him in bondage for the first 28 years of his life. "Well then," Tom said, "tomorrow we better start teaching you about rotating the herd to fresh pasture. Can't be a rancher without knowing how to manage your grass." Nakitso nodded solemnly, as if being entrusted with the most important knowledge in the world. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats, a single rider approaching from the south. Tom stood, instinctively positioning himself between the sound and the boy. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Get my rifle from above the door. Don't come out till I call you." Visitors were rare at the Lone Star Ranch, and unannounced ones even rarer. In this territory, such arrivals often meant trouble, especially for a black man whose success, modest though it was, sparked resentment among certain elements. Tom watched as a figure materialized on the dusty road, a lone rider on a paint horse, silhouetted against the fading light. As they drew closer, Tom's hand moved to the revolver at his hip, then froze in surprise. The rider was a woman. She wore buckskin leggings and a calico shirt, a woolen blanket draped across her shoulders despite the mild evening. Her black hair was pulled back in a thick braid that hung down her back. But what struck Tom most forcefully were her eyes, dark, proud, and fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill of recognition down his spine. Apache. She halted her horse about 20 paces from the porch, studying him with open assessment. "Thomas Washington," she said, her English accented but clear. Not a question, a statement. "Do I know you?" Tom asked, though something in her face tugged at his memory, a half-forgotten dream from another lifetime. "You did. Once." She dismounted in a fluid motion, keeping her horse between them like a shield. "I am Nasha of the Mescalero Apache." The name meant nothing to Tom, but there was something familiar in the way she held herself, the proud tilt of her chin. "What brings you to my ranch, Nasha of the Mescalero?" Her gaze flicked toward the cabin, then back to him. "I have come for the boy, my sister's son." Tom felt as if he'd been struck. "Nakitso?" "That is his name among our people, yes." Her voice remained level, but her eyes blazed. "He was lost to us when soldiers attacked our winter camp. His mother, my sister, died protecting him." Tom's mind raced. The boy's story matched hers, but after 6 months together, the thought of losing him felt like having a limb torn away. "How do I know you speak the truth?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "He has a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind his right ear. He was born during the winter solstice. His father was killed by Comanche raiders before he could walk." Each detail landed like a hammer blow, confirming what Tom already knew in his heart. She was who she claimed to be. "He's happy here," Tom said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "Safe. I've cared for him, protected him." "As any man should protect a child," Nasha interrupted, "but he belongs with his people, with his family." "I am his family now, too," Tom insisted. Something flashed in Nasha's eyes, anger perhaps, or disbelief. A black man and an Apache child. The world will never allow such a family to exist in peace. You know this. Before Tom could respond, the cabin door creaked open, and Nakitso stepped onto the porch, Tom's rifle clutched in his small hands. The moment the boy saw Nasha, the weapon clattered to the wooden boards. His eyes widened, his mouth forming a perfect O of shock. "Shyla," he whispered, using the Apache word for sister. Nasha's stern expression softened as she looked at the child. "Yes, little warrior. It is your Aunt Nasha." She spoke to him in Apache, words flowing too quickly for Tom to follow. Nakitso's response was immediate and devastating. With a cry that seemed torn from his very soul, he ran to her, flinging himself into her arms with such force that she staggered back a step. She enfolded him in her blanket, murmuring words of comfort as the boy's shoulders shook with sobs. Tom watched, his heart breaking even as he understood the rightness of their reunion. This was the boy's blood, his heritage, his true family restored. Yet when Nakitso turned to look back at him over Nasha's shoulder, the confusion and conflict in the child's eyes mirrored Tom's own turmoil. In 6 short months, bonds had formed that could not be easily broken, even by the powerful pull of blood and heritage. "He will return with me to our people tomorrow," Nasha announced, her tone making it clear this was not a request, but a statement of fact. "And if he doesn't want to go?" Tom asked quietly. Nasha's eyes hardened. "Would you keep him from his own kind? Make him forget who he is, where he comes from?" "I would never," Tom began, then stopped himself. "This isn't a decision to be made in haste. At least stay the night, we can talk more in the morning." Nasha studied him for a long moment before giving a single, curt nod. "One night. But when the sun rises, we ride north." As Tom led the way into his cabin, he felt as though the ground beneath his feet had suddenly disappeared. In a single moment, the future he had begun to imagine. Watching Nakitso grow into a man, working the ranch together, building something that would last beyond both their lifetimes, was crumbling like sand between his fingers. But deeper than his personal pain ran a current of doubt. Did he truly have any right to keep this child from his people, his culture, his heritage? And how could he stand in the way of family reunited when he himself had lost everyone he loved to the brutal machinery of slavery? There were no easy answers, and as night settled over the Lone Star Ranch, 3 souls beneath one roof wrestled with questions of belonging, identity, and the true meaning of family. This is the Black Rancher channel, bringing you the forgotten stories that shaped America. If you're just joining us, hit subscribe now and ring that notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates powerful stories of courage and sacrifice on the frontier. Now, let's continue with Chapter 4, where Tom Washington faces a revelation that will change everything he thought he knew about his past and the woman who has come to claim the child he's grown to love as his own. Dawn arrived with a clarity that seemed almost cruel. Tom had barely slept, spending most of the night in his rocking chair, listening to the soft sounds of Nakitso and Nasha speaking in low Apache tones from the boy's room. He rose before sunrise to prepare breakfast. Flapjacks with honey, the boy's favorite. A peace offering, perhaps, or simply a last meal together. Tom wasn't sure himself. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the woman. Something about her tugged at his memory. The proud set of her shoulders, the unwavering gaze. He'd encountered few Apache women in his life, yet Nasha seemed familiar in a way he couldn't explain. The cabin door opened, and she stepped into the main room alone, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, despite the growing warmth of the spring morning. "The boy still sleeps," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Tom nodded, gesturing to the table. "Coffee?" After a moment's hesitation, she sat, accepting the steaming mug he offered. They drank in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "He has grown strong in your care," Nasha finally said, studying Tom over the rim of her cup. "This I did not expect." "What did you expect?" Her expression hardened. "When I heard an escaped slave had taken an Apache child, I imagined many things, none of them good." "I'm not a slave," Tom said quietly, the old anger flaring briefly. "Haven't been for 15 years. "No," she agreed, her eyes never leaving his face. "For you are Thomas Washington now, owner of the Lone Star Ranch." Something in the way she said his name sent a shiver of recognition through him. "How do you know me?" he asked, setting down his coffee. "The truth, this time." Nasha's fingers tightened around her mug. "You truly do not remember?" It wasn't a question. "Should I?" She placed her right hand against her left shoulder, pressing against a specific spot. The gesture triggered something in Tom's memory, a flash of pain, the smell of blood and gunpowder, a woman's voice speaking words he didn't understand. "North Texas," he whispered, the memory suddenly crystallizing. 1861, after I escaped. Nasha nodded, her expression unreadable. "You were young, hunted. 3 white men tracked you to the edge of our hunting grounds." The images came faster now. Tom running through unfamiliar territory, the baying of hounds behind him, the crack of rifles. He had been free for less than a week, fleeing north from the Mississippi plantation where he'd been born in bondage. 3 patrollers had picked up his trail near the Red River. "I was shot," Tom said, his hand unconsciously moving to his left shoulder where an old scar still ached in cold weather. "Fell into a ravine." "Yes." Nasha's voice had softened slightly. "My father's hunting party found you there, bleeding, half dead. The white men were close behind." Tom's mouth went dry as the full memory returned. "Your father, he hid me, told the patrollers he'd seen nothing. He did more than that. He brought you to our camp. I tended your wound for 2 weeks while you recovered from the fever." Her eyes held his, challenging him to remember. And he did. Fragments at first, then more complete images. A hide-covered lodge, a young woman bathing his forehead with cool cloths. The same woman singing softly as she changed the poultice on his shoulder. Her face had been softer then, unmarked by the years of hardship that had followed, but the eyes were the same, proud, intelligent, uncompromising. "You," Tom breathed, recognition finally dawning. "You saved my life." "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them. "Why didn't you say so yesterday?" Nasha's mouth tightened. "Would it have changed anything? Would you have given up the boy more easily?" Before Tom could answer, a small voice came from the doorway of the bedroom. "You know each other?" Narkitso stood there in his nightshirt, eyes wide with confusion as he looked between the 2 adults. Nasha replied in Apache, too quick for Tom to follow, but the boy shook his head stubbornly. "English," he insisted. "Tom understands English." A flash of surprise crossed Nasha's face before she composed herself. "I was telling you that Mr. Washington and I met many years ago, before you were born." "She saved my life," Tom added gently. "When bad men were hunting me, just like bad men hunted your people." Narkitso processed this information with the solemn consideration that sometimes made him seem older than his years. "Is that why you helped me? Because she helped you?" The question struck Tom with unexpected force. Had some subconscious recognition guided his decision that night by the campfire? Had he seen something of Nasha in the boy's proud bearing, his resilient spirit? "I helped you because you needed help," Tom said finally. "Just as your aunt helped me when I needed it. That's what decent folks do for one another, regardless of where they come from." Nasha watched this exchange with guarded eyes. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge. "Come, nephew, eat your breakfast. We have a long journey ahead." The boy hesitated, looking to Tom with a question in his eyes that broke the rancher's heart. "Go on," Tom encouraged, forcing a smile. "Your aunt makes the best flapjacks you've ever tasted." "You make the best flapjacks," Narkitso contradicted, but he moved toward the table nonetheless. As they ate, an uneasy truce settled over the cabin. Narkitso, sensing the tension between the adults, filled the silence with chatter, switching between English and Apache with the ease of youth, unconsciously translating for both his guardians. When the meal was finished, Tom rose and took a small leather pouch from a shelf. "I have something for you," he told the boy, "something to remember our time together." Inside the pouch was a hand-carved wooden horse, similar to the one he'd made months earlier, but larger, more detailed, with real horsehair for the mane and tail. "Scout," Narkitso whispered, recognizing the likeness of Tom's faithful gelding. "So you'll always remember your first ride," Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. The boy clutched the carving to his chest, tears welling in his eyes. "I don't want to go," he said suddenly, turning to Nasha. "I want to stay with Tom." Pain flashed across Nasha's face. "Your place is with your people, with what remains of your family. The white man's world is no place for an Apache child." "Tom's world isn't white," the boy argued with the simple logic of childhood. "Tom's world is the Lone Star Ranch, and he's teaching me to read and ride, and someday I'll help him run the cattle." "Enough!" Nasha's voice cracked like a whip. "Pack your things. We leave within the hour." Nakitso's face crumpled, but years of Apache stoicism reasserted themselves. Without another word, he disappeared into his room. When he was gone, Tom turned to Nasha, his expression grave. "You're making a mistake." The mistake would be leaving him here, letting him forget who he is, what he comes from. "I would never let that happen," Tom insisted. "I've encouraged him to remember his mother, his traditions." "You cannot teach what you do not know," Nasha interrupted. "Could you show him how to track deer through the mountains, how to hear the spirits in the wind, how to dance the ceremonies that honor our ancestors?" Tom had no answer for this. He would grow up caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Nasha's voice softened slightly. "I know something of this burden. It is not one I would wish on my sister's child." Tom recognized the truth in her words, yet his heart rebelled against them. "At least let him visit sometimes. Let me know how he fares." Nasha studied him for a long moment. "Perhaps, when he is older, if he wishes it." It was a small concession, barely a promise, but Tom seized it like a drowning man grasping at a rope. "Thank you," he said simply. Nasha nodded once, then hesitated, as if weighing whether to speak further. "There is something else you should know," she said finally. "Something about the day we found you." Tom waited, sensing the importance of what was to come. "My father could have killed you. It would have been safer for our band. The white men hunting you were dangerous, armed." Her eyes held his, unwavering. "I asked him to spare you." "Why?" Tom asked, genuinely puzzled. "I was nothing to you, a stranger, a fugitive. Because I saw in you what I see in all creatures fighting for their freedom, the right to determine your own path." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "And because I had a dream the night before, of a black bear and an eagle sharing the same branch, neither prey nor predator to the other." Before Tom could respond to this unexpected revelation, Nakitso emerged from his room, a small bundle clutched in his arms. He had changed into the buckskin clothing he'd worn when Tom first found him, though it was now clean and mended. Around his neck hung the small medicine pouch Tom had helped him make to hold his mother's only surviving possession, a polished turquoise stone. The sight of the boy ready to depart hit Tom with physical force. He knelt down to Nakitso's eye level. "You listen to your aunt," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "She's wise and strong. She'll teach you important things about your people." Nakitso nodded, his small face solemn with the effort of holding back tears. "And remember," Tom continued, "the Lone Star Ranch will always be here. You'll always have a home with me if you want it." At these words, the boy's composure broke. He flung himself into Tom's arms, burying his face against the rancher's shoulder. "I'll come back," he whispered fiercely. "When I'm grown, I promise." Tom held him tight for a moment, memorizing the feel of the small body against his chest, the scent of the boy's hair, the sound of his breathing. "I'll be waiting," he replied simply. When they pulled apart, Tom was surprised to see Nasha watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read, not the anger or impatience he expected, but something more complex, thoughtful. She led the way outside, where her paint horse was already saddled. Tom followed with Nakitso, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder for what he knew might be the last time. As Nasha mounted and prepared to lift the child up behind her, she paused, fixing Tom with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through to his soul. "You have repaid your debt," she said quietly. "A life for a life. The circle is complete." Before Tom could respond, she pulled Nakitso up onto the horse behind her. The boy turned to look back at Tom, raising his hand in farewell as the horse began to move. Tom watched them go, two figures diminishing against the vast landscape, until they were nothing more than a speck on the horizon. Only then did he allow the tears to come, standing alone on the porch of a suddenly empty ranch house. He didn't know then that this wasn't an ending, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, in a story that would span decades and change not just his life, but the very fabric of the community around him. 8 years later, 1884, the Lone Star Ranch had prospered. What had once been 300 acres of mostly scrubland had expanded to nearly 800, with lush pastures supporting a herd of over 200 cattle. The original one-room cabin had grown too, with a proper kitchen, a covered porch wrapping around 3 sides, and a barn large enough to shelter 12 horses. Tom Washington, now 51, was no longer just a curiosity in the county, but a respected rancher whose advice on cattle breeding was sought by men who once wouldn't have met his eyes. His success hadn't come easily. There had been drought years, cattle thieves, and more than one confrontation with neighbors who resented a black man's prosperity. Through it all, Tom had persevered with the same quiet determination that had carried him from slavery to freedom, from fugitive to landowner. But the greatest trial had been loneliness. Not a day passed that he didn't think of Nakitso. In the first year after the boy's departure, Tom had ridden to the Northern Territories twice, seeking news of Nasha's band. Both journeys had proved fruitless. The Apache were masters at disappearing into landscapes that seemed empty to untrained eyes. Eventually, Tom had accepted that the promise of visits might never be fulfilled. The world had changed rapidly in 8 years. The railroad now cut across lands that had once belonged to the Apache. The army had intensified its campaign to move all tribes onto reservations. Newspapers spoke of the closing of the frontier as the last wild spaces yielded to settlement and civilization. On a warm June evening, Tom sat on his porch, pipe in hand, watching the sunset paint the western sky in gold and crimson. Scout, now an elderly horse enjoying a well-earned retirement, grazed peacefully in the nearby paddock. The evening was quiet, save for the distant lowing of cattle and the chirp of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. The sound of approaching riders broke the tranquility. Tom rose, hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Visitors at this hour rarely brought good news. 3 riders appeared on the road leading to the ranch house, a woman and 2 young men, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. Something in the lead rider's posture sent a jolt of recognition through Tom long before he could make out their features. Nasha. She had aged, her once black hair now streaked with silver, but she sat her horse with the same proud bearing he remembered. The 2 young men flanking her were clearly Apache as well, though they wore a mixture of traditional clothing and white man's attire. Tom's eyes fixed on the taller of the 2. Though much changed from the small boy he remembered, there was no mistaking those eyes, that resolute set of the jaw. Nakitso. "Hello, Tom Washington," Nasha called as they approached, her English smoother than he remembered. "Nasha," Tom acknowledged, his voice rough with emotion. "It's been a long time." She dismounted with the fluid grace that hadn't diminished with age, the young men following suit. Up close, Tom could see the years had been hard on her. New scars marked her hands and forearms, and a thin white line ran along her left cheek. "You remember my nephew," she said, gesturing to the taller youth. Nakitso stepped forward. At 13, he stood nearly as tall as Tom's shoulder, his frame wiry but strong. He wore his hair longer now, bound back with a leather thong, and a bone pendant hung at his throat, a warrior's talisman. "I remember my promise," the boy said in perfect English, extending his hand as Tom had taught him long ago. Tom took the offered hand, then, unable to maintain formality, pulled the boy into a fierce embrace. "I never thought I'd see you again," he admitted, his voice thick. When they separated, Nakitso's eyes were bright with unshed tears, though he maintained the composure expected of an Apache youth on the threshold of manhood. "This is my cousin Taklishim," he said, indicating the other young man, "son of my aunt Nasha." Tom nodded in greeting to the youth, who returned the gesture with cautious respect. "Come inside," Tom offered. "You must be hungry after your journey." As they settled around Tom's kitchen table, the awkwardness of reunion gradually gave way to conversation. Nakitso spoke eagerly of his life with the band, hunting expeditions, horse raids against rival tribes, his training as a medicine man's apprentice. His Apache heritage had clearly flourished under Nasha's guidance. Yet there were other details that surprised Tom. The boy had continued his reading, trading for books whenever the band encountered settlers or traders willing to deal fairly. He spoke not only Apache and English, but Spanish as well. And most surprisingly, he had maintained the small wooden carving of Scout all these years, keeping it wrapped in a piece of Tom's old shirt. I told the stories of the Lone Star Ranch so many times that the younger children think you're a legend, Narkitso admitted with a grin. The great black bear who befriends eagles. Tom caught Nasha's eye at this reference to her dream, but her expression remained impassive. As the evening progressed, however, Tom sensed an underlying tension in his visitors. There was something they weren't telling him, some purpose beyond a simple reunion. "What brings you here after all this time?" he finally asked directly. "Not that you aren't welcome, but 8 years is a long absence." Nasha and Narkitso exchanged glances. It was the woman who answered. "Our band has been forced onto the reservation at San Carlos," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The conditions there are not survivable. Disease, hunger. The agent steals half the supplies meant for our people and sells them for profit. Many have died," Narkitso added quietly, "mostly the very young and very old." "I'm sorry," Tom said, genuinely pained, "but I don't understand what brings you here." "We left the reservation," Nasha stated flatly. 37 of us, all that remains of our band. The army will be hunting us." Now Tom understood. "You're seeking sanctuary." "Not charity," Narkitso clarified quickly. "We can work, hunt, help with your cattle, but we need somewhere safe while we decide where to go next, somewhere they won't look for Apache fugitives." "A black man's ranch," Tom concluded, seeing the logic. Who would suspect a former slave of harboring Native Americans? It was an alliance so unlikely that it just might work. "It would not be forever," Nasha said, her pride evident even in asking for help. "Just until winter, when we can move south, perhaps into Mexico." Tom considered the proposition. Harboring fugitive Apache would be dangerous, potentially even fatal if discovered. The army took a harsh view of anyone who interfered with their Indian policies. He could lose everything he'd built over the past 2 decades. Yet as he looked at Narkitso, the boy he'd once thought of as a son, now nearly a man, he knew there was only one possible answer. "There's the old line shack by the North Creek," he said. "It's hidden in a stand of cottonwoods. With some work, it could shelter your people comfortably enough. The hunting is good there, and it's far enough from the main house that casual visitors would never know." Relief flooded Narkitso's face, quickly replaced by deep gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. Nasha's reaction was more complex. "Why would you risk everything you have built for people who are not your own?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Tom considered his answer carefully. 15 years ago, you asked your father to spare my life, because you saw in me a creature fighting for freedom. Now I see the same in you and your people." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "And perhaps because, in this country, those of us who have been hunted need to stand together if any of us are to survive." A moment of understanding passed between them. Not quite trust, not after so many years of separation, but a recognition of shared purpose that transcended the barriers of race and culture. "The others wait in the hills," Nasha said, practical now that the decision had been made. "I will bring them tomorrow night after dark." "I'll have the shack ready," Tom promised. Later, as the visitors prepared to leave, Narkitso lingered on the porch, reluctant to depart so soon after their reunion. "When I was small, I dreamed of returning to the Lone Star Ranch," he admitted, "but not like this, not bringing danger to your door." "Life rarely unfolds as we expect," Tom replied, resting a hand on the young man's shoulder. "But I'm glad you kept your promise to return, whatever the circumstances." Narkitso smiled, the expression transforming his solemn face. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into the pouch at his waist. "I made it myself." He handed Tom a small object wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside was a carving made of antler, an intricately detailed bear standing beside an eagle, the two animals sharing a branch that formed a perfect circle. "Black bear and eagle," Tom murmured, recognizing the significance. "Nasha told you about her dream." "She says the spirit sent you to me and me to you," Narkitso explained. "That our paths were meant to cross, to teach both our peoples that different tribes can share the same hunting grounds. if they approach with respect. Tom turned the carving over in his hands, moved by both the craftsmanship and the sentiment behind it. "It's beautiful. Thank you." As the three visitors mounted their horses to return to their band for the night, Nasha paused, looking back at Tom with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, a softening of her habitual reserve, almost a smile. "You have done well, Thomas Washington," she said. "My father would be proud of the man you have become." It was the highest praise an Apache could offer, and Tom accepted it with a nod of deep respect. As they rode away into the gathering darkness, Tom stood on his porch, the carved talisman clutched in his hand. The circle Nasha had spoken of 8 years earlier, a life for a life, had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined. What had begun as a simple act of compassion toward a lost child had rippled outward, creating connections that defied the prejudices and conflicts of their time. Over the months that followed, the Lone Star Ranch became a sanctuary not just for Nasha's band, but for others seeking refuge from a world intent on erasing their very existence. Tom Washington, once a fugitive himself, found a new purpose in creating a place where differences were strengths rather than barriers. And Nakitso, the lost child who had brought together two unlikely allies, grew to manhood straddling two cultures, Apache warrior and educated rancher, embodying the possibility that even in a land torn by conflict, understanding could take root and flourish. Years later, when visitors to the prosperous Lone Star Ranch expressed surprise at the unusual community that had developed there, Black, Apache, and eventually Mexican families working side by side, Tom would simply show them the antler carving that held the place of honor on his mantle. Black bear and eagle, he would explain, different creatures sharing the same branch. That's the true story of the West, not just the battles and bloodshed that fill the history books, but the alliances formed by those who recognized in each other a common humanity, a common dream of freedom. Thank you for staying with me until the end of The Black Rancher Adopted a Lost Apache Child and Faced the Mother Who Once Saved His Life. If you enjoyed this story of honor, destiny, and redemption on the American frontier, please hit that subscribe button now if you haven't already. Share this video with someone who appreciates powerful storytelling about the forgotten heroes who shaped our nation. Your support helps ensure these important stories continue to be told. This is The Black Rancher, bringing history to life one story at a time. Until next time, remember that our past is filled with untold connections that cross the boundaries we too often take for granted. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.